What kind of cowboy lets a woman trust him for weeks without mentioning that every acre beneath her feet belongs to him? Rain hammered the kitchen roof as ruined flour spilled across Grace Parker's hands. Walter Briggs ordered her gone before sundown. Then the towering cowboy beside the stove rose. "Nobody fires anyone here without my permission." Briggs snapped, "It's your ranch, Daniel." Grace went still. "Your ranch. Stay with us." Rain hammered the roof of Blackstone Ranch hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Grace Parker stood behind the long kitchen work table, with both hands pressed into a mound of flour that should have smelled faintly sweet and dry. Instead, it smelled like kerosene. She lifted her fingers and stared at the gray-white powder clinging to them. A dark stain had spread through the bottom of the sack. Another sack leaned open beside it, ruined the same way. Behind her, the stove popped and hissed. Beef broth simmered in a black iron pot, forgotten for the moment. Grace heard boots gathering outside. Too many boots. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned. The doorway between the kitchen and bunkhouse dining room was crowded with cowboys. Some still wore dripping slickers. Others had removed their hats and held them against their chests, not out of respect, but because there was nowhere else to put them. Nearly 40 men had been expecting supper. Now they were watching her. Walter Briggs pushed through the doorway, carrying another flour sack across one shoulder. The ranch foreman was a narrow man in his 40s, with a graying mustache and the stiff-backed walk of someone who enjoyed being obeyed. Rainwater ran from the brim of his hat. He dropped the sack onto Grace's work table. It landed with a dull thump. A pale cloud rose between them. Kerosene hit the air immediately. Grace's jaw tightened. Briggs hooked a thumb into his belt. "There's another one in the storehouse." Grace looked at the sack. "Don't open it." His eyebrows went up. "I wasn't planning to eat it. If the oil hasn't soaked through the lining, part of it might still be usable." Briggs gave a short laugh. A few men behind him shifted. Grace ignored them. She crossed to the shelf where she kept her inventory book and reached for it. Briggs put his hand on the cover first. "Won't need that." Grace looked down at his fingers, then up at him. "Move your hand." The room grew quieter. Outside, rain rattled against the windows in hard silver sheets. Somewhere beyond the kitchen wall, a horse kicked a stallboard. Briggs slowly removed his hand. Grace opened the ledger. 3 barrels of flour had arrived 9 days earlier. 2 sacks had been moved from the dry storeroom yesterday morning. She knew because she had written it herself. "Who was in the storehouse last night?" Briggs leaned against the table. "You're asking questions now? I'm trying to find out what happened. I'll tell you what happened." Grace closed the book. Briggs swept one hand toward the ruined food. "You happened." Something shifted among the cowboys. Grace felt it without looking at them. She had known that feeling before. A room waiting to see whether she would be embarrassed. Waiting to see whether she would raise her voice. Waiting to see whether the large woman in the flour-streaked apron would prove whatever story somebody had already decided to tell about her. Grace folded her hands over the ledger. "Explain." Briggs stared at her. "You took over the stores. You changed how things were stacked. You moved barrels. You started sealing this and drying that. You told everybody the old system was wasteful. It was. And now we've got ruined flour, spoiled beans, half a side of smoked beef gone missing, and a starter crock smashed on the pantry floor." Grace's eyes moved toward the pantry, the sourdough starter. She hadn't seen that yet. For 6 weeks, she had fed that starter every morning before dawn. Her mother's recipe began with it. She stepped around the table. Briggs blocked her. "Where are you going?" "To look." "There's nothing to look at." Grace stopped. That sentence bothered her more than the accusation. Briggs had always enjoyed criticizing. He had never stopped her from checking something herself. She looked past him. At the far end of the dining room, one man sat apart from the others. Daniel. His broad shoulders nearly filled the bench beneath him. Even sitting down, he seemed too large for the furniture. His faded brown shirt was damp at the shoulders, and mud darkened the knees of his trousers. His old hat rested beside one enormous hand. Grace knew those hands. They had hauled firewood into her kitchen, held a lantern while she checked smoked beef after dark, peeled potatoes badly enough that she had threatened to take the knife away from him. Once, after she burned the first batch of biscuits because a chimney damper jammed, Daniel had eaten 3 without saying a word. She had thought he was being kind. Later he admitted he simply liked burned edges. Now he wasn't smiling. His gaze rested on Briggs. Grace looked away first. She didn't want his sympathy. Not here. Briggs stepped closer. We've got men coming in soaked from the north pasture. We've got stores ruined before winter. And I've spent 6 weeks watching this kitchen get turned upside down because you figured you knew better than people who've worked Blackstone for 20 years. Grace's voice stayed level. The kitchen hasn't missed a meal in 6 weeks. Nobody spoke. You've eaten every supper I've served. Briggs's mouth flattened. So have those men. One cowboy near the doorway lowered his eyes. Another rubbed his thumb along the edge of his hat. Grace continued. The smoked meat was counted Monday. The flour was dry yesterday morning. Those beans were sealed. Kerosene doesn't climb into sacks by itself. Briggs's face hardened. You calling somebody here a thief? I'm saying food doesn't ruin itself. You hear that? Briggs turned toward the men. She's been here 6 weeks, and now she's accusing ranch hands who've given years to this place. I didn't accuse anyone. You don't have to. Grace felt heat rise under her collar. She pressed one palm against the table. Not because she was afraid of Briggs, because she knew what happened when anger spoke before thought. She had spent too many years being dismissed for taking up too much space already. She would not give him another reason. Briggs turned back. Pack your things. Grace stared at him. Rain hit the roof once, twice. A dozen hard beats passed before she spoke. What did you say? You heard me. You don't employ me. I'm foreman of Blackstone, and I'm the cook you hired for roundup season. I hired you on trial. You hired me through November. Briggs gave a humorless smile. Not anymore. Grace glanced toward the men. Nobody met her eyes for long. That hurt more than she expected. 6 weeks of feeding them, remembering who liked extra coffee, who couldn't stomach onions, which young hand always saved half a biscuit for his night watch. And now they stood silent, because Walter Briggs had decided silence was easier. Grace reached behind her and untied her apron. She did it slowly. If she was leaving, she would leave standing straight. Briggs nodded toward the back rooms. Get your trunk. Supply wagon's heading into Pine Hollow before dark. Grace folded the apron once, then twice. A chair scraped across the wooden floor. The sound stopped everyone. Daniel stood. Grace had seen him rise 100 times, but never in a room this quiet. At 6'7", he made the doorway behind him look narrow. He picked up his hat but didn't put it on. Briggs exhaled through his nose. Sit down, Brooks. Daniel didn't. He walked toward the kitchen. Slowly. No swagger. No dramatic hurry. Just one heavy step after another until he stood a few feet from Briggs. Grace held the folded apron against her waist. Daniel looked at the ruined flour, then at the opened pantry, then at Briggs. Did you see her spill the kerosene? Briggs's eyes narrowed. No. See her break the starter crock? No. See her remove the beef? That's not the point. Daniel's voice remained quiet. Seems close to it. Briggs glanced toward the other men, annoyed now. "You've been hanging around this kitchen long enough to forget how a ranch works." Daniel didn't answer. Briggs stepped nearer. "This is my responsibility." "No." One word. Nothing loud about it. But the room changed. Briggs blinked. Daniel set his hat on the table. "Your responsibility is the men and the cattle. Nobody gets dismissed from Blackstone without my say." Grace frowned. She looked at Daniel. Briggs's face went red. For the first time since Grace had known him, the foreman's temper slipped past his careful little smile. "Then handle her yourself." Daniel's expression changed. Only slightly. A warning Grace didn't understand. Briggs didn't care. He jabbed a finger toward the ruined stores. "It's your ranch, Daniel. You handle her then." Nobody moved. Grace felt the folded apron slide half an inch through her fingers. She caught it. Her eyes went to Daniel, then to Briggs, then back to Daniel. The sound of rain seemed farther away now. Her mind moved through 6 weeks in pieces. Daniel splitting wood behind the kitchen. Daniel asking whether she needed another shelf. Daniel sitting with the ranch hands at supper. Daniel letting her complain about whoever owns this place buying cheap flour. Daniel listening while she talked about how badly the storehouse had been managed. Daniel saying almost nothing. She had assumed he was another hired cowboy because his boots were scuffed and his shirts were plain and he worked until his hands were dirty. And he had never once corrected her. The main ranch house on the rise. The cattle spread across miles of valley. The barns, the horses, the land disappearing into rain beneath the mountains. Blackstone. His. Grace slowly placed the folded apron on the table. Daniel opened his mouth. "Grace." She raised her eyes to his. Whatever he saw there made him stop. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. "Your ranch?" 6 weeks earlier, Grace Parker had stepped down from a stagecoach in Pine Hollow, believing the hardest part of her new life would be convincing 38 hungry cowboys that she belonged in their kitchen. She had been wrong. The coach rolled away behind her in a cloud of pale road dust, leaving Grace beside a weathered bench with one battered trunk, a carpet bag, and $29 folded inside the lining of her purse. Pine Hollow was smaller than she had imagined. One broad dirt street ran between a mercantile, a hotel, a blacksmith shop, 2 saloons, a feed store, and a whitewashed church whose bell tower leaned slightly toward the mountains. Beyond the rooftops, dark ridges rose one behind another, their upper slopes still holding narrow streaks of old snow despite the summer heat. Grace stood for a moment and adjusted the cuff of her brown traveling dress. The stage ride had left dust along the hem. Her back ached. One pin had come loose from her hair somewhere outside Helena, and a strand kept brushing her cheek. 2 women near the hotel looked at her. Grace knew that look. Their eyes went first to her face, then lower, then back again. Neither woman said anything, but one leaned toward the other. Grace picked up her carpet bag. She had stopped needing to hear the words years ago. 3 weeks earlier, in a boarding house kitchen nearly 200 miles away, she'd been standing over a pan of biscuits when Mr. Avery's 2 sons asked her to come into the dining room. Their father had died in February. Grace had cooked for him for 4 years. She knew exactly how he liked his coffee, how much salt he wanted in stew, and which cupboard contained the bottle of medicine he took every evening after supper. His sons knew none of those things. What they knew was that they had inherited a profitable boarding house, and they wanted to improve it. Grace had stood beside a table laid with white cloth while the older brother cleared his throat. "We're making changes." She remembered wiping flour from her fingers onto her apron. "What kind?" "Presentation." He had said the word as if it explained everything. The younger brother stared at the window. "We want the dining room to feel more refined." Grace waited. The older brother finally looked at her. "Customers like a woman who looks right serving the room," there it was. Not cruel enough to challenge. Not kind enough to misunderstand. Grace had looked from one brother to the other. Then she asked, "Will you be needing breakfast tomorrow?" The younger one blinked. "No." "Then I'll collect my wages tonight." She finished the biscuits before leaving. Not for them. For the guests who had already paid for supper. Afterward, she packed her mother's recipe book, 3 kitchen knives wrapped in cloth, 2 dresses, stockings, a good apron, and the few things she had accumulated in 4 years. She cried only after she was a mile down the road. Even then, she stopped before the wagon driver noticed. Now Pine Hollow stretched before her, unfamiliar and sun-bleached. Grace took the folded employment letter from her bag and checked the address again. Blackstone Ranch, seasonal cook, room and board included, wages paid monthly through the end of roundup season. The letter had been signed by Walter Briggs, foreman. A shadow fell across the paper. "Looking for somebody?" Grace looked up. A woman stood in the doorway of the mercantile, wiping her hands on a blue apron. She appeared to be somewhere in her 50s, with iron-gray hair pinned tightly at the back of her head, and the practical expression of someone who had spent years deciding which troubles deserved attention. Grace folded the letter. "Blackstone Ranch." The woman's eyebrows rose. "You're the new cook." "That's what the letter says." Then Briggs finally found somebody. She held out a hand. "Louise Harper. Grace Parker." Louise's handshake was quick and dry. She glanced at the trunk beside the bench. "Stage driver leave that there?" He did. "Figures." Louise stepped out beneath the mercantile awning. "You eaten?" Grace hesitated. "No." "Come inside. I should probably find the ranch wagon. It won't leave without you." Louise pushed open the screen door. "And if it does, I'll make whoever's driving it come back." There was something in the way she said it that made Grace follow. The mercantile smelled of coffee beans, leather, soap, lamp oil, and dried apples. Bolts of cloth stood along one wall. Sacks of flour and cornmeal were stacked near the counter, each with a chalk price written on a small board. Louise cut a thick slice from a loaf, spread it with butter, and pushed it across the counter. Grace reached for her purse. Louise frowned. "It's bread, not a land deed." Grace put the purse away. "Thank you." Louise poured coffee into a chipped white mug. "Blackstone's a long day if you arrive hungry." Grace took a bite. The bread was plain and good. "How far?" 9 miles by the South Road. Longer if Cottonwood Creek's high." Grace glanced toward the window. "Big place?" Louise gave her a look. "Big enough." That wasn't an answer, but Grace had learned not to waste questions on people who enjoyed holding them. Louise leaned against the counter. 38 men most of the season, sometimes more during roundup. Briggs likes things done his way. So did my last employer. Did it bother you? No. Louise's mouth twitched. Then Briggs may have met his match. A wagon rolled to a stop outside. Harness chains jingled. Louise looked through the window. Speaking of Blackstone. Grace finished her coffee and carried the mug to the wash basin. I can leave that. I know. Grace rinsed it anyway. When she stepped outside, the first thing she saw was the horses. 2 sturdy bays stood hitched to a broad ranch wagon, their coats darkened with sweat along the harness. Then she saw the man beside them. Grace stopped. He was enormous. Not merely tall. Tall men were common enough in cattle country. This man made the wagon look smaller. He stood well over 6.5 feet, broad through the shoulders and chest, wearing a faded work shirt rolled to the elbows, dark trousers tucked into worn boots, and an old brown hat that had seen too many seasons to be fashionable. Nothing else about him suggested importance. No silver buckle, no polished gun belt, no expensive coat. His gloves were tucked into one back pocket. A scar crossed one knuckle. Dust coated his boots nearly to the ankle. He looked like a cowboy who had spent the morning working rather than waiting for passengers. Grace became aware that she was staring. He noticed. Neither spoke for a second. Then he touched 2 fingers to his hat. "Miss Parker?" "Grace Parker." His eyes were gray. That surprised her for some reason. "Daniel Brooks." His voice matched the rest of him. Low. Quiet. She looked toward the wagon. "Blackstone?" He nodded. Louise appeared behind Grace carrying the carpet bag. "Don't let Briggs scare her off before supper." Daniel took the bag from Louise. "Wasn't planning to." Louise looked at Grace. "I said Briggs." Grace almost smiled. Daniel reached for the trunk. Grace put her hand on the opposite handle. "I can carry it." He looked at her hand, then at the wagon bed. "Didn't say you couldn't." He bent, took one end, and waited. Grace stared at him. Most men would have laughed. Some would have insisted. A few would have made a performance of lifting the whole thing to prove something neither of them had asked to prove. Daniel simply waited. Grace took the other handle. Together they lifted. The trunk was heavier than she remembered. Her mother's cast-iron skillet was packed inside beneath 2 folded dresses, along with the knives and recipe book. Daniel didn't pull it away from her. He adjusted his pace to hers. They slid the trunk into the wagon. "Thank you," Grace said. "Sure." That was all. Daniel climbed onto the driver's seat and took the reins. Grace settled beside him, leaving a respectable space between them. The wagon creaked forward. Louise lifted one hand from the mercantile porch. Grace returned the gesture. Then Pine Hollow began slipping behind them. They passed the blacksmith shop, the church, and a row of cottonwoods growing along a narrow drainage ditch. Soon, the buildings disappeared altogether. The road stretched across open grazing country. Sagebrush crowded the drier slopes. Cottonwoods marked the creek bottoms in crooked green lines. Farther west, the mountains rose dark against a wide blue sky. For the first mile, Daniel said nothing. Grace finally asked, "You always this talkative?" He glanced at her. "No." She waited. A few seconds passed. Then she realized that had been the whole answer. Grace looked away before he could see her smile. The wagon rolled over a rut. Daniel slowed the horses before the next one. "Briggs tell you much about the job?" 38 men, seasonal work, room and meals. That's about what Briggs tells anybody. "You work in the bunkhouse?" "Sometimes." "Cattle?" "Mostly." Another vague answer. Grace studied him from the corner of her eye. His hands held the reins loosely, but the horses responded to the smallest movement. A man used to being listened to. She filed the thought away. A mile later, they reached a wooden gate marked Blackstone in faded black paint. Daniel climbed down. Before Grace could move, he opened it and stood aside. The wagon passed through. Then he closed the gate behind them. Beyond it, the land widened. Cattle dotted the valley floor. Fences stretched farther than Grace could follow. A line of barns stood in the distance, and beyond them rose a large white ranch house on higher ground. Grace leaned slightly forward. "That's Blackstone?" Daniel climbed back onto the wagon. "That's it. You've worked there long?" He gathered the reins. His eyes rested on the ranch ahead. "A while. Grace looked toward the distant house again. Something about his answer struck her as strange. But the wagon had begun moving. The wind carried the smell of grass and cattle toward them. And somewhere ahead waited 38 hungry men who had never met Grace Parker and had no reason yet to believe she belonged among them. She straightened her skirt. Daniel glanced at her once, then back to the road. Neither of them knew that before the summer ended, the woman beside him would become the one person at Blackstone whose opinion he feared losing. And Grace Parker still believed she was riding beside an ordinary cowboy. The wagon rolled beneath a second gate just after 4 in the afternoon. Blackstone Ranch seemed to keep unfolding the farther Grace looked. The first barn sat near a wide corral, packed with restless horses. Beyond it stood 2 bunkhouses, a smokehouse, a tack room, a smithy, and several low sheds roofed with weather-darkened boards. Men moved everywhere. One was mending a fence rail. 2 others were unloading salt blocks from a freight wagon. A group of cowboys rode in from the south pasture with dust rising around their horses' legs. Higher on the slope stood the main house. White paint, 2 stories, a deep porch. Grace looked at it only briefly. The kitchen she had been hired to run was attached to the larger bunkhouse near the corrals. Daniel drew the team to a stop beside it. Before Grace could climb down, a lean man in a gray vest came striding across the yard. Walter Briggs. She knew him immediately from the signature on her employment letter. He had a narrow face, a trimmed mustache, and a silver watch chain stretched across his vest. His boots were cleaner than the boots of every other man Grace had seen since leaving Pine Hollow. Briggs stopped beside the wagon. His gaze went to Daniel first. "You're late." Daniel set the brake. Cottonwood roads washed rough. Briggs's eyes moved to Grace. They stopped there, for half a second too long. Then he smiled, not warmly. "Miss Parker." Grace climbed down without waiting for Daniel's hand. "Mr. Briggs." He looked at her trunk, then at her, then toward the kitchen door. Grace had seen that calculation before. She waited. Briggs cleared his throat. "I'll be plain. We feed 38 men most nights, more during roundup. They eat at 6. Breakfast starts before 5 in the morning. Dinner goes out to the crews when needed." Grace nodded. "All right." Briggs seemed disappointed she had not asked whether she could manage it. The last man knew the place. "Then why isn't he here?" Daniel turned his head slightly. Briggs's mouth tightened. "My brother-in-law had other arrangements." Grace understood enough. "You wanted him back." Briggs stared at her. "I wanted somebody who understood ranch work. I understand hungry men." That earned the faintest sound from somewhere behind her. Grace looked back. Daniel had lowered his head, but she saw the corner of his mouth move. Briggs did too. His expression hardened. "You've got until supper." Grace glanced at the sun. 2 hours? Little less. To do what? Feed them. Grace looked toward the kitchen. 38? 38. Briggs folded his arms. "If supper goes badly, we don't drag this out for a month pretending it might improve." There it was, the challenge. Grace removed her gloves 1 finger at a time. "What time do the men come in?" 5:45, and you said supper at 6. "That's right." Grace looked toward Daniel. "Would you bring my trunk inside?" Daniel nodded. "Sure." Briggs started to speak. Grace had already walked past him. The kitchen was larger than the one at the boarding house, but in worse condition. 2 iron stoves stood against the back wall. One had ash spilling beneath the door. Copper pots hung from hooks, though several had blackened bottoms thick with old grease. A butcher block table occupied the center of the room. Shelves held flour, beans, coffee, salt, onions, dried apples, and several jars of preserves. Grace opened the pantry. More potatoes, salt pork, 2 cuts of beef, half a sack of carrots. Enough. She set down her carpetbag and rolled up her sleeves. Daniel carried the trunk inside. Where? Against that wall. He placed it exactly where she pointed. Grace opened it and removed her mother's recipe book, the knife roll, and the heavy skillet wrapped inside an old towel. Daniel watched the skillet come out. That traveled all the way from wherever you came from. It traveled farther than you have. He considered that. Probably. Grace looked at him. You still here? He glanced toward the door. Apparently. Then bring me 2 buckets of water. He went. No complaint, no question. Grace almost smiled. She didn't have time. By 4:30, one stove was burning cleanly. By 5, beef stew was simmering in the largest pot she could find. Grace browned onions in the skillet, added potatoes and carrots, then used flour to thicken the broth. She checked the pantry again. Not enough bread already made. Biscuits, then. Fast. She mixed flour, salt, lard, and milk in a broad wooden bowl. Daniel returned with water, then came back again carrying an armload of split wood. Grace pointed toward the stove. Not that much. He stopped. You want less wood? I want steady heat. I'm baking biscuits, not shoeing horses. Daniel looked at the stove, then removed half the wood. Yes, ma'am. Grace paused. Don't call me ma'am. His eyes lifted. What should I call you? Grace. He nodded. Grace. Something about hearing her name in that low voice made her hands slow for 1 second. Then the dough stuck to her fingers. Reality returned. She went back to work. At 5:30, the smell had reached the yard. Grace knew because men began passing the kitchen door more often than necessary. One cowboy stopped and peered inside. She looked up. Something you need? He glanced at the stew. No. Then stop letting the heat out. He vanished. Daniel leaned against the far counter. That was Charlie Mills. Does Charlie Mills know how doors work? Not around supper. Grace gave him a flat look. Daniel looked at the floor. This time she knew he was hiding a smile. At 5:45, the bunkhouse dining room filled. Benches scraped across the floor. Wet neckerchiefs came off. Hats piled along pegs by the door. The noise rose like a storm of its own. Grace stood behind the pass-through with her hands resting against the table. Briggs appeared beside the doorway. He checked the wall clock, then the food. You ready? Grace lifted the first stew pot. Open the door. He blinked. Grace looked at him. You want them fed? Briggs opened it. 38 men entered hungry. Grace did not try to charm them. She filled bowls, cut biscuits, sent platters of potatoes down the tables. She watched portions carefully. The largest men got a little more. The youngest ranch hands, who looked too proud to ask for seconds, got them anyway when she made another pass. For the first 5 minutes, there was talking, then less, then almost none. Grace could hear spoons scraping pottery. Someone tore a biscuit in half. Another man said, very quietly, "Pass those down." That was all. She stood near the kitchen doorway and folded her arms. Briggs took one bite of stew. His expression didn't change. He took another, then another. Grace looked farther down the table. Daniel sat at the end among the ranch hands. He finished his first bowl, then held it out when the stew pot came by. Second. Grace raised one eyebrow. Daniel ignored her. He finished that one too. then reached for another biscuit. Grace stepped beside him. Thought cowboys were supposed to have manners. Daniel looked at the biscuit in his hand, then at her. We do until supper. For 1 second, Grace tried not to laugh. She lost. The sound came out before she could stop it. Small, warm, real. Several men looked up. Grace shook her head and returned to the kitchen, but the corner of her mouth stayed lifted. After supper, the men carried their bowls to the wash bench. A few mumbled thanks. Charlie Mills came back for one last biscuit and stopped when Grace looked at him. He pointed toward the basket. Is that one spoken for? Grace slid it toward him. You asked this time. Learning already. The dining room slowly emptied. Briggs stayed long enough to inspect the kitchen. He looked at the empty stew pot, the biscuit basket, the men walking out satisfied, then at Grace. Breakfast is at 5. I remember. He nodded once and left. No praise. Grace hadn't expected any. She began stacking pots. One of the large kettles was heavy enough that she had to brace it against her hip. A hand closed around the opposite handle. Daniel, I've got it. Grace held on. So do I. He looked at her, then adjusted his grip. Together, then. They carried it to the wash bench. Outside the kitchen window, Walter Briggs had stopped beneath the porch overhang. Rain had not yet started, but dark clouds were gathering over the mountains. He stood with one hand against a post, watching. Not Grace. Daniel. Daniel didn't seem to notice. Grace did. She followed Briggs's stare for a moment, then looked at the giant cowboy beside her. Daniel had rolled his sleeves higher and was scraping stew from the pot with a wooden spoon. You planning to eat that too? He looked down. Would be ashamed to waste it. Grace laughed again. Outside, Briggs's face went still, and for the first time since Grace Parker arrived at Blackstone Ranch, the foreman looked less concerned about the new cook than about the man who had decided to remain in her kitchen. Daniel came back before sunrise the next morning. Grace heard him before she saw him. One heavy step on the porch, then another, then a knock against the kitchen door. Not loud, just 2 knuckles against wood. She was standing over the stove with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, stirring oatmeal while coffee boiled in 2 dented pots. The windows were still black. Dawn had not yet reached the mountains. Grace frowned at the door. It's open. Daniel stepped inside carrying an armload of split wood. You always knock on open doors? Usually. Why? He set the wood beside the stove. Because they're still doors. Grace looked at him for a moment, then returned to the oatmeal. You'll make a poor outlaw. I've been told worse. He reached for another log. Grace stopped him. 1. Daniel paused. 1? 1 log. He looked at the stove. Yesterday it was too much wood. Today you're learning. Daniel put 1 log in. Grace almost smiled. By the end of the first week, he had learned enough to stay out of the way. That turned out to be useful. Blackstone woke early. Men came through the kitchen before 5 for coffee, biscuits, bacon, and whatever Grace could put together fast enough to keep them moving. By 6, half the ranch was already somewhere beyond the corrals. Grace spent mornings in motion, flour dust on her wrists, coffee grounds under her nails, the smell of onions, wood smoke, and hot iron following her from room to room. Some days Daniel came in carrying wood. Some days he repaired things without being asked. A loose shelf, a pantry latch, the handle on a flour bin that had threatened to come off in Grace's hand 3 times. He never announced what he was doing. He simply noticed. One morning Grace entered the kitchen and stopped. Daniel was sitting at the work table. 3 sacks of potatoes stood beside him. A bowl rested between his knees. He was peeling. Badly. Grace stared at the potato in his hand. What did that poor thing ever do to you? Daniel looked down. Half the potato was missing with the peel. You had 3 sacks. That doesn't mean I wanted 2 sacks left when you're done. He held out the knife. You want it back? Grace took the potato instead. Thin. She shaved one long peel from it and handed it back. Daniel watched, then tried again. Better, not good, but better. Grace nodded once. Acceptable. High praise. Don't get used to it. He kept peeling. She started bread dough beside him. For nearly half an hour, neither of them spoke. Grace found she liked that. Most people mistook silence for something that needed fixing. Daniel did not. He could sit in it without making her carry the weight of conversation. That was rare. By the second week, Grace knew more about Blackstone than she had expected. Charlie Mills took his coffee with enough sugar to ruin it. Old Hank Foster pretended not to like jam, then scraped the jar clean when no one watched. Young Tommy Reed from the stable always came in late and hungry because he fed the horses before himself. Walter Briggs drank coffee black and complained if it was too hot, too cold, too strong, or too weak. Daniel drank whatever Grace handed him. One morning she deliberately gave him coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. He took one sip, paused, then drank again. Grace watched. Well? Daniel looked into the mug. Coffee. That's your opinion? Seems accurate. She laughed. He glanced up. Every time she did that, something changed in his face. Not much. His mouth rarely moved, but his eyes did. Grace began noticing. She wished she hadn't. It would have been easier if Daniel were handsome in an obvious way. Instead, she kept discovering him by pieces. The patience in his hands when he repaired something small. The way he stepped aside when she carried a hot pot instead of reaching for it without asking. The way he listened all the way through an answer. His size should have made him clumsy in the kitchen. It didn't. He moved carefully because he knew exactly how much room he occupied. That, too, Grace noticed. One morning, Daniel returned from the foothills with a folded cloth in one hand. He placed it on her work table. Grace opened it. Wild huckleberries. Dark purple. Small. Still cool from the mountain shade. She looked at him. Where'd you get these? Up near Bear Ridge. You rode all the way up there? Had cattle to check. And these happened to fall into your pocket? More or less. Grace touched one berry. She had not eaten fresh huckleberries since childhood. Her mother used to simmer them with sugar until the kitchen windows fogged. Grace wrapped the cloth again. Thank you. Daniel nodded and turned toward the woodpile. Wait. He stopped. That evening, when supper was finished and most of the men had gone, Grace put a small bowl on the table in front of him. Warm berry cobbler. Daniel looked at it, then at her. No one else got that. I noticed. You going to complain? No. Grace set down a spoon. Good. Daniel ate slowly. He didn't say anything until the bowl was empty. Then he pushed it back. Best thing I've had in a long time. Grace wiped the table with a cloth. You say that about everything, no? She looked at him. Daniel's gaze held hers. I don't. Grace turned back to the table. The cloth moved over the same clean spot twice, 3 times. Outside, evening settled over Blackstone. Cattle lowed beyond the corrals. Someone played a harmonica near the bunkhouse. Grace concentrated very hard on a stain that wasn't there. The subject of her eating house came up on a Sunday. Sunday meant fewer men at breakfast and a slower evening meal if weather allowed. Grace had taken inventory after supper and was sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil tucked behind one ear, totaling flour purchases. Daniel appeared in the doorway. He knocked. Grace looked up. "You know I'll let you in." "Still a door?" She shook her head. He came inside. His shirt was cleaner than usual, though still plain. Grace glanced at the ledger. "If you're looking for pie, Hank Foster got the last piece." Daniel sat across from her. "I can survive. Questionable." He rested his forearms on the table. Grace finished one column, then another. Daniel looked at the sheet. "You keep records for everything?" "If I don't, somebody eventually tells me something cost more than it did." "Fair." Grace closed the ledger. For a while they listened to the wind moving through the cottonwoods. Then Daniel asked, "You planning to cook forever?" Grace leaned back. "That's usually what cooks do, I mean here." She studied him. There was no mockery in his face. She looked toward the small kitchen window. "No." Daniel waited. Grace rubbed the pencil between her fingers. "I want my own place." He said nothing. That helped. "Not big," Grace continued. 6 tables, maybe. Enough room for travelers and local families. Good coffee. Clean windows." Daniel nodded. "What color door?" Grace looked at him. "What?" "Every place ought to have something you remember from the road." She considered that. "Blue. Blue. Deep blue. Not that washed-out kind people put on sheds." Daniel's mouth moved slightly. "Particular." "Very." "What else?" Grace felt foolish now, but the picture had lived in her head too long to disappear. A stove that draws properly, shelves that don't lean, a pie case near the front. And one rule. Daniel waited. Nobody insults the cook and gets dessert. This time he smiled. Not almost. Actually smiled. It changed his whole face. Grace stared before she could stop herself. Daniel noticed. The smile faded, but not completely. "Seems fair." Grace cleared her throat. "What about you?" He looked down at his hands. "What about me?" "What do you want?" The question changed him. His fingers stopped against the table. For the first time since Grace had known him, he seemed caught without an answer. His gaze moved past her toward the window. From the kitchen, the main house could be seen on the rise through the trees. Daniel looked at it longer than necessary. "Haven't decided yet." Grace frowned. "You're what, 35? 36? Then you might want to hurry." He looked back at her. "You always this encouraging?" "I charge extra for encouragement." Daniel lowered his head. Grace saw the smile again. She didn't notice Walter Briggs standing beyond the half-open pantry door until it moved. Grace turned. Nobody was there. She thought perhaps she had imagined it. Briggs had not imagined anything. He had been carrying a list of cattle supplies to the office when he heard Daniel laugh. He stopped outside the kitchen and listened long enough to hear Grace describe 6 tables and a blue door. Long enough to hear Daniel ask questions no ranch owner had any reason to ask his cook. Long enough to understand what Grace still did not. Daniel Brooks had spent years refusing dinners arranged by neighboring ranch families. He had ignored daughters of cattlemen, merchants, and one banker from Helena. Yet here he was, peeling potatoes before sunrise and gathering berries in the mountains. Briggs folded the supply list once. Hard. Inside, Grace opened her ledger again. Daniel rose. "I should go." Work? Something like that. Grace pointed toward the empty cobbler bowl. Take that to the wash bench. Daniel picked it up. At the doorway, he paused. He tapped twice against the frame. Grace looked up. What now? Blue door. She stared at him. He nodded toward the kitchen. Think it'd suit you. Then he left. Grace sat alone with the ledger open in front of her. She tried to finish the flour total. She added the same column 3 times. Outside, Daniel crossed the ranch yard toward the main house, unaware that Walter Briggs was watching from the shadow of the tack room. Grace believed Daniel was only another cowboy. Briggs knew better, and he knew something else now. The owner of Blackstone Ranch was beginning to care far too much about the woman in the kitchen. Grace knew none of that. What she knew was flour. How quickly it turned damp when sacks sat too close to an outside wall. How long smoked beef would keep if the smokehouse stayed dry. How many pounds of beans 38 men could put away in a week when roundup work stretched from dawn until dark. By the 3rd week, she had started writing everything down. Not because anyone asked, because no one else seemed to be doing it properly. The storehouse ledger was a mess of old numbers, crossed-out deliveries, and penciled guesses. 2 invoices from Pine Hollow had been tucked behind a barrel of salt pork. A freight receipt for coffee had grease across the bottom, where somebody had used it beneath a lantern. Grace carried the papers into the kitchen one afternoon and spread them across the table. Daniel came in with a broken chair under one arm. He stopped. Looks serious. It is. He set the chair down. What happened? We're living from wagon to wagon. Daniel glanced toward the papers. We've always had supply wagons. That's not the same thing. Grace tapped one receipt. This shipment came 4 days late last October. Another. This one came 6 days late. Daniel pulled out a chair. Grace pointed toward it. That one's good. He looked at the broken one under his hand. Right. He sat. Grace turned the ledger around. Blackstone has enough livestock to feed half this county, but beef isn't the problem. Flour is. Coffee, salt, dried fruit, beans, vegetables. If the South Road washes out or the pass closes early, you're short within a week. Daniel studied the figures. You think winter will come early? I think mountains don't care what I think. He looked at her. Grace folded her arms. I want to dry more vegetables, seal flour in the inner bins, smoke another side of beef, and make ration sacks for the line camps. Daniel's gaze remained on the ledger. How much work? A lot. How much cost? Grace slid another page toward him. I wrote it there. He read carefully. That surprised her. Most ranch hands she knew could read well enough, but Daniel studied invoices like someone accustomed to numbers. Grace noticed. She stored that away, too. After a moment, he said, Do it. Grace frowned. Do what? What you just said. You're not Briggs. No. So I wasn't asking permission. Daniel leaned back. Good. Good? You shouldn't. Grace stared at him, then slowly gathered the receipts. You're a strange cowboy, I've been told. The next morning, Briggs found 2 ranch hands helping Grace move flour barrels away from the north wall. He stopped in the doorway. What's this? Organization. Grace didn't turn around. Briggs looked toward Daniel, who was carrying a crate of clean jars. Since when does the cook reorganize ranch stores? Grace marked a shelf with chalk. Since the cook started finding damp flour. Briggs scoffed. We've fed men here 20 years, and you've wasted food for 20 years too. One of the ranch hands coughed into his fist. Daniel looked down. Briggs heard it. His face tightened. You're preparing for problems that aren't coming. Grace placed another jar on the shelf. I'd rather prepare for 10 storms that don't come than one that does. Briggs pointed toward the crates. This costs money. Daniel finally spoke. I've seen the numbers. Briggs looked at him. And? They make sense. A quiet settled over the storehouse. Grace barely noticed it. She was checking the lid on a flour bin. Briggs noticed. He stared at Daniel for several seconds, then walked out. That afternoon, Daniel offered to take Grace into Pine Hollow for salt, vinegar, jars, and additional canvas sacks. She accepted because the freight wagon wouldn't be leaving for another 3 days. The sky was clear when they started. By noon, it wasn't. Grace sat beside Daniel on the wagon seat while gray clouds gathered over the mountains. You said it wouldn't rain. Daniel looked at the sky. I said it didn't look like rain. Those sound suspiciously similar. One's less certain. You ought to go into politics. He glanced at her. That's unkind. Grace smiled. They reached Pine Hollow before the first drops. Louise Harper had most of what Grace needed. Salt came in 50-pound sacks, vinegar in stoneware jugs. Grace bought 24 jars, several yards of sturdy muslin, 3 packets of cinnamon she had not planned to buy, and a small tin of nutmeg after Louise lowered the price by 2 cents. Daniel watched her calculate the total. You bargain over nutmeg? I bargain over everything. You paid full price for coffee. Coffee is serious. Louise nodded from behind the counter. She's right. Daniel gave up. They loaded the wagon as rain began striking the mercantile awning. Not heavy yet, just steady. Louise looked toward the west. You two better move. Daniel tightened the canvas over the supplies. Cottonwood? Could rise. Grace climbed onto the seat. We crossed it this morning. Louise's expression said that fact meant very little. The road home became darker by the mile. Rain drummed against Daniel's hat. Grace pulled her shawl tight. The wagon wheels sank deeper into the road. By the time they reached Cottonwood Creek, water had spread beyond its morning banks. Daniel stopped the team. Grace leaned forward. The creek had become a brown, fast-moving sheet. Can we cross? Daniel watched a branch tumble past. No. Grace sighed. Wonderful. He looked back toward the road. The line cabin's about half a mile east. Dry? Mostly. That isn't reassuring. It's got a roof. That helps. They turned off the road. The cabin sat in a grove of cottonwoods, one small room built for cowboys working distant cattle. Inside were 2 bunks, a table, a cold iron stove, a lantern, and enough dust to prove no one had used it recently. Daniel brought in wood from the covered box outside. Grace checked the roof. 1 leak. She placed a tin basin beneath it. Rain ticked into the metal. By dark, the stove was warm. Grace made coffee and fried a little salt pork from the wagon supplies. Daniel sat on the opposite side of the table. 1 lantern burned between them. The room felt smaller after sunset. Grace noticed how close his knees came to the underside of the table. This place wasn't built for you. Most places aren't. She handed him a tin plate. They ate quietly. Rain struck the roof. The creek roared somewhere beyond the trees. Grace should have felt uneasy. A woman alone overnight with a man she barely knew would have been enough to feed Pine Hollow gossip for a month. Instead, she felt strangely calm. Daniel had already chosen the floor. He had rolled his blanket beside the stove before Grace could ask. She had noticed that too. After supper, Grace sat on 1 bunk with her mother's recipe book open across her knees. Daniel was repairing a loose strap on the supply harness. He looked up. That your mother's? Grace touched the worn cover. Yes. She teach you? Everything important. Daniel waited. Grace turned one page. Her mother's handwriting filled the margins. Smaller amounts, changes in baking time, notes beside recipes that had gone wrong once and been corrected later. She used to say food told you more about people than conversation did. Daniel threaded the leather strap through a buckle. How? People lie in conversation. His eyes lifted. Grace shrugged. Nobody lies when they're hungry. He thought about that. Probably true. Grace closed the book. What about your mother? Daniel's hand slowed. Died when I was 17. I'm sorry. He nodded once. My father died 3 years ago. Grace watched him. Something in the way he said father carried more weight than the word itself. You too close? Daniel looked at the lantern. Depends what you mean. Grace didn't push. He had never pushed her. She owed him the same. Silence filled the cabin again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Rain softened, then strengthened. Grace looked toward the small window. You ever think about marriage? Daniel's head came up. She almost laughed. I didn't propose. Good. That frightened you? No. It did. It surprised me. Grace folded the blanket beside her. I used to. Think about marriage? Yes. Daniel waited. Grace looked down at her hands. She had broad hands, strong fingers, small burn marks from ovens, a thin white scar along one thumb where a knife slipped when she was 19. The problem with feeding people, she said, is they get used to taking the plate. Daniel said nothing. Grace continued because the rain made it easier to look at him. Men liked my biscuits, my pies, my coffee. They liked coming around kitchens where I worked. She rubbed her thumb across the recipe book, but somehow they always liked what I cooked better than the woman cooking it. The words settled between them. Grace wished immediately that she had not said them. She looked toward the stove. Daniel's jaw had tightened. Not pity. Something closer to anger. He said, Sounds like they ate well and saw poorly. Grace's throat tightened before she could stop it. She turned toward the window. That's a nice thing to say. It's not nice. She looked back. Daniel's eyes stayed on hers. It's true. Grace held his gaze for 1 second. 2. Then she opened the recipe book again, although she could no longer read the page. A long while passed. Later, when the lantern had burned lower, Grace asked, Why do you care so much about Blackstone? Daniel went very still. Grace noticed. You talk like it's yours sometimes. He looked toward her. The rain ticked steadily into the basin beneath the leak. This was the moment. Daniel knew it. Grace didn't. He could have told her. He could have said the ranch belonged to him. That the main house on the hill was his. That every business decision she had complained about landed eventually on his desk. Instead, he looked away. Been here a long time. Grace frowned slightly. That all? Mostly. She accepted it. That made it worse. Daniel lowered his gaze. The lantern flame shifted. Grace stood to hang her shawl closer to the stove. When she turned back, Daniel was closer than she expected. He had risen to move the chair. They stopped. Only a step separated them. Grace could see rain drying along the edge of his collar. Daniel looked down at her. She had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes. Neither moved. Grace felt her breathing change. Daniel's hand lifted slightly. Not touching. Waiting. Her eyes dropped once to his mouth, then rose again. Daniel saw. For one suspended second, she thought he would kiss her. She did not step away. Daniel leaned the smallest distance closer, then stopped. His hand lowered. He stepped back. Grace stared at him. Something unreadable crossed his face. "Good night, Grace." He turned toward his blanket beside the stove. Grace sat slowly on the bunk. "Good night." She lay awake longer than she intended. Not angry, not relieved. Listening to rain move across the roof. By dawn, Cottonwood Creek had fallen enough for the wagon to cross safely. They packed in silence. Daniel loaded the supplies. Grace climbed beside him. Neither mentioned the moment beside the lantern. The road toward Blackstone shone wet under the morning sun. Grace looked ahead. Daniel kept both hands on the reins, and between them traveled the one truth that might have changed everything. Grace had trusted him enough to tell him why she no longer believed men chose women like her. Daniel had been given the perfect chance to trust her in return. He had chosen silence. For the next several days, Grace tried not to think about that night beside Cottonwood Creek. She had work. Work was useful because it did not ask questions back. By 4 each morning, the kitchen stove was hot. By 5, coffee was poured into thick white mugs. By 6, the breakfast room smelled of bacon grease, biscuits, and wet wool as the first riders came in from checking cattle along the creek bottoms. Daniel still came to the kitchen door. He still knocked. Grace still let him in. But something had changed. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for her. When he brought wood, she thanked him and went back to work. When he sat to peel potatoes, she gave him the knife without teasing him. When his hand brushed hers reaching for the coffee tin, she moved first. Daniel noticed. He said nothing. That was somehow worse. Near the end of the week, Grace finished preparing the first emergency ration sacks. Each canvas bag held hard biscuits, dried beef, beans, salt, coffee, and a small twist of sugar. She labeled them in charcoal and stacked them on a shelf in the dry storehouse. Daniel stood in the doorway watching. How long will those keep? If the mice don't find them first long enough. We have cats. Then tell the cats they work for me now. Daniel almost smiled. Grace turned back to the shelf. He stayed there another moment. Grace. She stopped. He seemed about to say something. Her pulse gave one hard beat. Then Walter Briggs came around the corner carrying a coil of rope. Brooks, North Fence. Daniel looked toward Briggs, then back at Grace. Whatever he had intended to say disappeared. He put on his hat. I'll see you later. Grace nodded. Probably. The word came out colder than she meant. Daniel left. Briggs watched him go. Then he looked at Grace. Got him carrying sacks for you now, too? Grace closed the storehouse door. I didn't ask him. You never seemed to. No. Briggs gave a short laugh. Funny how that works. Grace studied him. What exactly are you trying to say? Nothing. Then you're doing a fine job of it. Briggs's smile vanished. For a second, she saw something underneath. Not jealousy exactly. Something harder. Then he walked away. Grace stood alone beside the storehouse. A faint smell reached her. Kerosene. She turned. The lantern rack hung 20 feet away near the tack room. The scent faded. Grace frowned, then went back inside. 3 mornings later, she found the first ruined sack. It was flour. The bottom had darkened where oil soaked through the canvas. Grace crouched and touched it. The smell was unmistakable. Kerosene. She stood. The shelf above was dry. The roof did not leak. No lantern was stored in the room. She checked the next sack. Clean. Then the next. Ruined. Her stomach tightened. Grace pulled out her inventory book. The flour had been delivered 9 days earlier. She had checked it the previous afternoon. Dry. Sealed. She moved farther into the room. One barrel of beans had its lid sitting crooked. Grace opened it. The top layer smelled wrong. Oil again. She backed away. Then she noticed the empty space on the smoked meat rack. "Where are you?" Half a side of beef was missing. Grace moved faster now. She checked the second rack. Then the third. Nothing. Her eyes went to the pantry. The sourdough crock sat on the floor in pieces. For one long second, Grace didn't move. The starter had come from her mother's recipe, not literally the same batch. That was impossible after so many years. But the method was hers. The habit. The smell. The small daily ritual of flour and water before dawn. Grace stared at the broken crock. Then she heard boots outside. Briggs appeared in the doorway. Behind him stood 2 ranch hands. His expression was already set. "What happened?" Grace looked at him. "You tell me." He stepped inside. His eyes moved over the flour, the beans, the missing meat, the shattered crock. Then he swore under his breath. Too quickly. Grace noticed. "Who was in here last night?" Briggs ignored the question. "What in God's name have you done?" Grace straightened. "I checked this room yesterday, and now half the stores are spoiled." "Yes." "You were the one who rearranged everything." "Yes." "You were the one keeping count." "Yes." "And somehow none of this happened until you took over." Grace felt something cold settle inside her. The 2 ranch hands behind him said nothing. "Get Daniel," she said. Briggs's jaw moved. "What?" "Get Daniel. He's out by the west pasture." "Then send someone." Briggs stepped closer. "This isn't his concern." Grace laughed once. There was no humor in it. "You've spent 3 weeks acting like everything I touch becomes ranch business. Now suddenly it's not his concern?" The ranch hands exchanged a look. Briggs's face darkened. "You're forgetting your place." Grace closed the inventory book. "No. I know exactly where I am." By noon, word had spread. Men drifted toward the bunkhouse earlier than usual. Grace hated that most. Not the accusations. The watching. She knew those eyes. People waiting to see if she would cry. If she would shout. If she would prove herself troublesome enough to make dismissal feel reasonable. Briggs dragged one ruined flour sack into the kitchen. Rain had started outside. A hard summer storm coming down from the mountains. He dropped the sack onto Grace's work table. Flour burst from the seam. The smell of kerosene filled the room. "That's enough." Grace stood opposite him. "Enough of what?" "This." He pointed toward the ruined flour. "The waste, the changes, the special arrangements." Grace wiped flour from her fingers. "The flour was dry yesterday." "So you say." "Half the smoked beef is gone." "You miscounted." "No." "You've been here 6 weeks. I can count in 6 weeks." Somebody near the doorway shifted. Briggs looked toward the men, then back at Grace. "You came in here thinking you knew better than everyone. I came here to cook. You changed the storehouse because it was badly kept. You told men who've been here 15 years how to handle food because they were leaving flour against damp walls. You built ration sacks nobody asked for because someone should have. Briggs slapped one palm against the table. Enough. The room went still. Grace did not flinch. Briggs pointed toward the back hall. Pack your trunk. Grace stared at him. You don't have grounds. I don't need them. You hired me through Roundup, and I'm ending it. You cannot accuse me of something you can't prove. I don't have to prove it. Grace's hand tightened around the edge of the table. There it was. The old, familiar thing. Not evidence. Authority. Briggs turned toward the men. She leaves before dark. No one answered. Grace looked from one face to another. Charlie Mills, Hank Foster, Tommy Reed, men she had fed for 6 weeks, men who had asked for seconds and thirds, men who had come to her for coffee before dawn. Most looked at the floor. Grace swallowed. Then a bench scraped. Daniel stood. He had come in without her noticing. Rain darkened his shoulders. Mud streaked his boots. His hat rested in one hand. He looked at Briggs. Did you see her spill the kerosene? Briggs's face changed. No. See her take the beef? No. Then stop talking like you did. Briggs stepped toward him. Stay out of it. Daniel didn't move. You don't dismiss anybody from Blackstone without my say. Grace looked at him. Something in the room shifted. Briggs laughed sharply. Your say? Daniel's eyes stayed on him. Yes. Briggs's temper finally broke. Fine. He stabbed a finger toward Grace. It's your ranch, Daniel. You handle her then. Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that changes a room. Grace's fingers stopped against the flour-covered table. Her eyes moved to Daniel. He didn't look like an owner. He looked exactly as he had that first day beside the wagon. Faded shirt, old boots, work-worn hands, the same cowboy who had carried one end of her trunk because she refused to let him carry both. Grace looked toward the window. Beyond the rain stood the barns, the corrals, the bunkhouses, the main house on the hill, miles of pasture disappearing beneath the storm. She looked back at Daniel. His face had gone still. Grace. Your ranch? He took one step toward her, yes. The word struck harder than she expected. Grace looked down at the table. Flour clung to her knuckles. She remembered the line cabin, the lantern, her telling him about men who liked her cooking more than they liked her, her asking why he cared so much about Blackstone. Been here a long time. Grace laughed softly. Daniel's face tightened. Grace. She untied her apron. Not here. She walked into the kitchen. He followed. Behind them, the ranch hands remained silent. Grace set her apron on the counter and opened the small cupboard where she kept her mother's recipe book. Daniel stopped near the door. Let me explain. She took out the book. Go ahead. People change when they know. Grace turned. Know what? Who I am. Who you are. What I own. She stared at him. And you thought I would? I didn't know, so you decided for me. No. That's exactly what you did. Daniel looked as if she had struck him. Grace kept her voice low. That made every word sharper. You listened while I complained about the owner. I know. You let me tell you how badly his storehouse was run. Yes. You let me talk about my wages. I didn't set those terms. That isn't the point. He went quiet. Grace held the recipe book against her chest. You stood in that cabin and let me tell you the most humiliating thing I know how to say about myself. Daniel's jaw tightened. Grace. And then I asked you a simple question. She looked directly at him. Why did a ranch hand care so much about Blackstone? He said nothing. You had every chance. I wanted you to know me before you knew the ranch. Grace shook her head. That sounds better in your mouth than it feels in mine. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly. I wasn't trying to make a fool of you. I know. He blinked. Grace stepped closer. That's what makes it worse. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. You decided what I was allowed to know until you got what you wanted from me. Daniel stared at her. What did I get? Grace stopped. For half a second, neither moved. Then she looked away. Trust. That silenced him. Grace went to the back room and pulled her trunk from beneath the narrow bed. Daniel appeared in the doorway. I can drive you to Pine Hollow. No. It's raining. I've noticed. Grace. She folded 2 dresses into the trunk. Don't. Daniel stayed where he was. His hands hung loose at his sides. For once, all that size meant nothing. Grace packed her knives, her recipe book, her apron, a small blue cloth Louise had given her for covering bread. Daniel spoke quietly. I am sorry. Grace stopped packing. She did not turn. I believe you, he breathed out. Then she added, that doesn't make me ready to stay. A supply wagon was leaving for Pine Hollow before dusk. Grace climbed onto the seat beside Charlie Mills. Daniel stood under the bunkhouse awning as rain fell beyond the roof edge. He did not try to stop her. He did not order Charlie to put her trunk back down. He did not offer money. Grace had expected part of herself to be relieved by that. Instead, as the wagon passed through the Blackstone gate, she found herself gripping the seat hard enough to hurt. She did not look back. Daniel did. He stood in the rain after the wagon disappeared from sight. Behind him, the kitchen door remained open. For 6 weeks, Grace Parker had believed the greatest difference between Daniel Brooks and other men was that he trusted her to make her own choices. Now he understood exactly what he had broken. And for the first time since inheriting Blackstone Ranch, Daniel owned everything around him and could not use any of it to bring back the one person whose trust he wanted. Grace reached Pine Hollow after dark. The supply wagon stopped behind Louise Harper's Mercantile, where a narrow outside stair climbed to 2 rented rooms above the store. Louise was closing the shutters when she saw Grace's trunk in the wagon bed. She did not ask what happened. That was one of the reasons Grace liked her. Louise simply took the lantern from its hook and said, "Room upstairs is empty." Grace climbed down. "I can pay." "I know." Louise led her through the back door. The room was small enough that Grace could stand beside the bed and touch the washstand without taking 2 full steps. It had a narrow window facing Main Street, a rope bed with a faded quilt, 1 chair, and a nail beside the door for hanging clothes. Grace set her mother's recipe book on the washstand. Louise placed the lantern beside it. "Kitchen downstairs is cold after 7. Grace looked at her. Louise shrugged. "I bake badly." That was all. By 4 the next morning, Grace was kneading bread in the Mercantile kitchen. She needed money. Working made the hours pass. Louise sold 6 loaves before noon. The next day, Grace baked 10. By the end of the week, people were coming in early enough to ask whether the bread was ready before Louise had unlocked the front door. Grace took no satisfaction in that, or told herself she didn't. She measured flour, fed the small starter she had begun again from scratch, swept the floor, counted coins. At night she climbed the stairs, loosened her hair, and sat beside the window until the lamps along Main Street went dark one by one. Blackstone lay 9 miles away. It might as well have been 90. Daniel did not come. No flowers arrived. No wagon pulled up with some foolish gift large enough to make Pine Hollow talk. No message asking Grace to reconsider. On the fourth morning, Louise handed her an envelope. From Blackstone. Grace's fingers stopped over the bread knife. She looked at the envelope. Plain paper. Her name written in Daniel's hand. She almost left it unopened. Then she wiped her hands and broke the seal. Inside was her final pay. Exact to the cent. No extra money. No bonus. No attempt to buy forgiveness. A folded note contained only 3 lines. Your wages through the day you left. The room and board deduction has been waived. Daniel Brooks. Grace read it twice, then folded it again. Louise watched from behind the counter. He trying to be clever? No. That worse? Grace put the money into her purse. I haven't decided. At Blackstone, Daniel ate supper at the end of the bunkhouse table. The same place he always had. But the chair beside the kitchen door stayed empty. A new cook had not been hired. For now, the ranch hands took turns doing what they could. Charlie Mills burned the beans. Hank Foster made biscuits hard enough that Tommy Reed tried bouncing one off the table. Nobody laughed very much after that. Daniel stood once and walked into the kitchen. Grace's apron was gone from its peg. Her blue bread cloth was gone. The jar of cinnamon near the stove was gone. The room smelled like boiled beef and smoke. Nothing else. He opened the pantry without knowing why. The shelves were still marked in Grace's handwriting. Flour, beans, coffee, dried apples. Emergency ration sacks sat in a neat row along the upper shelf. Daniel closed the door. On the work table lay one chair Grace had always pushed toward him when he came in early. He sat down. The room was quiet. He remembered her laughing when he peeled potatoes too thick. Remembered the way she said his name at Cottonwood Creek. Remembered the exact change in her face when Briggs said, "It's your ranch, Daniel." He rubbed one hand over his jaw. Then Walter Briggs walked in. "You wanted me?" Daniel looked up. "Inventory." Briggs frowned. "What about it?" "Bring me the storehouse records." Briggs hesitated. "Why?" Daniel stood. "Because I asked." Something in his voice ended the conversation. Briggs returned 15 minutes later carrying 2 ledgers. Daniel spent the evening comparing them to Grace's book. At first, nothing looked wrong. Then he found one missing coffee delivery. 3 sacks of flour paid for, but never recorded in storage. A shipment of salt pork whose receipt showed more weight than the pantry ledger. He checked again. The numbers still did not match. Near midnight, Tommy Reed appeared in the doorway. The stable boy had hay caught in his hair and looked as if he regretted coming. Daniel closed the ledger. "What is it?" Tommy rubbed his hands against his trousers. "Mr. Brooks, yeah. I saw something." Daniel waited. Tommy looked toward the hall. Night before Miss Parker found the spoiled flour. Daniel went still. "What did you see?" "Mr. Briggs." The boy swallowed. "He was by the storehouse." "What time?" "Late. Past 11. "You sure?" Tommy nodded. "I was with the bay mare. She'd gone lame. I came back for liniment." Daniel leaned forward. "Was Briggs carrying anything?" "Lantern." Tommy hesitated. "And one of those little kerosene cans." The room seemed to narrow. Daniel stood so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. Tommy flinched. Daniel stopped himself. "You did right telling me." The boy nodded and left. Daniel stood alone. Then he opened Grace's ledger again. This time he did not read it like a ranch owner checking expenses. He read it like evidence. Grace had recorded everything: dates, amounts, delivery times, missing goods, damaged goods, even the days she had moved flour away from damp walls. By dawn, Daniel knew two things. Grace had not ruined those stores, and whoever had wanted her blamed had been counting on no one taking her records seriously. He rode into Pine Hollow shortly after 8. The morning was clear and cold enough to put breath on the horses. He tied his gray gelding outside Harper's Mercantile. Through the front window, he saw Grace carrying a tray of bread from the back kitchen. She saw him, too. For 1 second, neither moved. Daniel took off his hat. Grace set the tray down. Then she crossed the kitchen. Daniel thought she was coming to the door. Instead, he heard the lock turn. He stood outside. Grace remained on the other side of the glass. Her face gave him nothing. Daniel did not knock. He did not ask Louise to let him in. He simply waited. 5 minutes. Then 10. A wagon passed behind him. 2 women entered the Mercantile through the front door and glanced at the enormous cowboy standing hatless beside the bakery entrance. Daniel stayed where he was. Inside, Grace began slicing bread. Her hands were steady. Only once did she look toward the window. Daniel was still there. He had not tried the handle, had not raised his voice, had not used his name. Grace looked away. By noon, he finally left. He rode back to Blackstone with the cold wind against his face and Grace's locked door fixed in his mind. That evening, he searched the storehouse again. Behind a stack of empty grain sacks, he found a crate marked on Grace's ledger as delivered 3 weeks earlier. It should have contained coffee. It was empty. Daniel looked toward the doorway. Outside, Walter Briggs was crossing the yard. Daniel closed the crate lid. For the first time since Grace left, regret gave way to something sharper. Someone had tried to make her look incompetent, and now Daniel intended to find out why. He started with the freight receipts. By sunrise, 3 ledgers lay open across the dining room table at Blackstone. 1 belonged to the storehouse. 1 came from the ranch office. The 3rd was Grace's. Daniel worked slowly. He checked dates twice, weights 3 times. He compared coffee deliveries against pantry counts, flour receipts against missing sacks, and tack purchases against the numbers Walter Briggs had approved. The pattern was not obvious at first. That was the point. A sack here, a crate there. A half shipment recorded as full. 2 coils of rope billed twice. Nothing large enough to draw attention alone. Together, the losses stretched back months. Daniel leaned back in his chair as morning light crept across the floorboards. Walter Briggs had been stealing from Blackstone long before Grace Parker arrived. Grace had simply started counting carefully enough to make it dangerous. By 8, Daniel had sent Charlie Mills into Pine Hollow with instructions to find the freight operator named on several questionable receipts. By 10, Tommy Reed brought another piece. The boy stood in Daniel's office, twisting his hat in both hands. I remembered something else. Daniel closed the ledger. Go on. Mr. Briggs used to send boxes out on the South Freight wagon. What boxes? Didn't know. Coffee crates sometimes. Flour sacks once. How often? Tommy frowned, thinking. Every couple weeks, maybe. Did anybody help him? Sometimes a fellow from town. Red beard, drove a freight team. Daniel knew the man. Earl Jensen, a freight operator who hauled goods between Pine Hollow and smaller settlements east of the valley. Daniel stood. Thank you, Tommy. The boy started toward the door. Daniel called after him. Tommy. He turned. You did nothing wrong by not telling me sooner. The boy nodded, but his shoulders loosened. By late afternoon, Charlie returned with confirmation. Jensen had been selling coffee, flour, preserved meat, and ranch equipment through a trading post 2 towns east. The goods were cheap, too cheap, and Briggs's name had appeared on at least one private receipt. Daniel read it once, then folded it. Walter Briggs was repairing a corral gate when Daniel found him. The sky had cleared, but the ground was still soft from the storm. Briggs looked up from the hinge. "You need something?" Daniel held out the receipt. Briggs's face changed before he touched it. That was enough. Daniel said, "How long?" Briggs wiped his hands on his trousers. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel did not raise his voice. "How long have you been selling Blackstone stores?" Briggs glanced toward the men working farther down the fence. "Keep your voice down." "No." Briggs's jaw tightened. "This ranch wastes more in a month than I've taken in a year." Daniel stared at him. "So you admit it?" Briggs swore under his breath. "I've given 15 years to this place, and you thought that made the stores yours. I thought it earned me something. You were paid, not what the ranch earned." Daniel's face went still. Briggs looked toward the barns, then toward the distant main house. "This place got bigger. You got richer. Everybody else stayed where they were." Daniel folded the receipt once. What did Grace have to do with it? Briggs said nothing. Daniel stepped closer. What did she have to do with it? Briggs laughed bitterly. She counted. That was all. But Daniel understood. Grace had reorganized the stores, recorded every shipment, saved receipts, marked shortages, prepared lists. She had done in 6 weeks what nobody else had bothered to do in years. Briggs had seen the end coming, so he made Grace the problem before anyone discovered the real one. Daniel's voice dropped. You poured kerosene into those sacks. Briggs looked away. You broke the starter crock. Silence. You stole the meat. Briggs finally met his eyes. I needed her gone. Daniel's hand tightened around the receipt. For one moment, something raw moved through him. Then he let it go. Grace did not need rage on her behalf. She needed the truth. You are finished here. Briggs stared at him. Daniel, pack your things. You can't mean that. I do. After 15 years? Daniel's eyes did not move. After 15 years, you should have known better. Briggs opened his mouth. Daniel stopped him. And Jensen's name goes to the sheriff with yours. Briggs's face drained. You'd do that? Daniel folded the receipt into his pocket. You did it. He turned away. By sunset, Briggs was gone from Blackstone. The ranch felt different without him. Quieter. Not better yet. Just honest. The next morning, Daniel rode into Pine Hollow. He carried Grace's ledger in one saddlebag and her missing final inventory sheet in the other. This time, he did not stand outside the bakery waiting for her to unlock the door. He knocked. Once. Then stepped back. Grace opened it after a long moment. Flour dust marked one sleeve of her dress. Her hair was pinned loosely. She looked tired. Daniel removed his hat. I know what happened. Grace said nothing. He held out the ledger. Briggs was stealing. Her eyes went to the book. Daniel continued. Flour, coffee, meat, tack, maybe more. He'd been sending goods out through a freight operator for months. Grace took the ledger. Her fingers brushed his. Both noticed. Neither mentioned it. He ruined the stores because I was counting them. Yes. Grace looked down at the cover. I thought something was wrong. You were right. She gave a small, humorless breath. That seems to happen to me more often than people enjoy. Daniel looked at her. I should have listened sooner. You didn't know. I knew Briggs disliked you. That's not the same thing. No. He paused. I fired him. Grace looked up and reported the theft. Her expression changed slightly. Not satisfaction. Relief, maybe. Or simply the quiet settling of something that had been left unfinished. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. I also owe you an offer. Grace did not take it. What kind? Your job back. She stared at him. Higher wages. Full control of kitchen stores. No. Daniel nodded. Grace blinked. She had expected argument. He folded the paper again. All right. That's it? You said no. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. Daniel put the paper back into his coat. The job isn't why I came. Her face changed. Only a little. But he saw it. Daniel looked down at his hat. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I miss you. Grace said nothing. I miss getting thrown out of your kitchen because my boots were muddy. Her mouth twitched once. I miss you telling me my coffee isn't fit for civilized people. I said your coffee could strip paint. That too. Grace looked away. Daniel continued. I miss you laughing when I peel potatoes wrong. You do peel them wrong. I know. He lifted his eyes. And I miss sitting at that table when neither of us had anything to say. Grace's hand tightened slightly around the ledger. The street behind him was quiet. A wagon rattled past the far end of Main Street. Somewhere inside the mercantile, Louise moved a crate across the floor. Grace looked at Daniel again. What do you want me to say? Nothing. Daniel. I mean it. He stepped back from the doorway. You don't owe me another chance because I finally learned how to tell the truth. The words stayed between them. Grace's face lost its guarded edge for 1 second. Daniel saw it. He did not move closer. That mattered, more than she wanted it to. You should know one more thing, he said. What? I was wrong at the creek. Grace went still. I should have told you. He swallowed. I wanted one place where somebody looked at me and didn't see Blackstone first. Grace said nothing. Daniel continued. But I made that your problem without asking if you wanted it. Her eyes dropped. He put his hat back on. I'm sorry. This time the apology carried no request behind it. No expectation. No bargain. Daniel turned toward his horse. Grace watched him walk away. He mounted. For 1 second she almost called his name. She didn't. Daniel rode toward the north road and disappeared beyond the church. Grace closed the bakery door. Then she stood with her back against it. The ledger remained in her hands. That evening, after Louise locked the mercantile, Grace climbed to her room. A small square of painted wood rested on the washstand. Louise had brought it 2 days earlier from a carpenter who was repainting a storefront near the edge of town. Deep blue, not pale, not washed out. Exactly the color Grace had once described to Daniel while he peeled potatoes in Blackstone's kitchen. She picked it up, turned it in the lamplight. 6 tables, clean windows, good coffee, a blue door. For weeks that dream had meant a place where Grace would never again have to depend on anyone else's judgment. Now another thought had entered beside it. A giant cowboy standing outside her door, telling her the truth even though it gave him no guarantee she would open it. Grace set the blue sample down. She did not forgive him that night. She did not decide to return to Blackstone. But for the first time since leaving the ranch, she stopped telling herself that Daniel Brooks had come into her life only to prove why trusting a man was foolish. And that small change frightened her almost as much as hope. 3 mornings later, Pine Hollow woke under a sky the color of old tin. Grace noticed it before breakfast. The light coming through the mercantile windows had a flat, strange look to it. No warmth, no shadow, just a pale gray wash over Main Street and the church steeple across the road. Louise Harper stood at the front window with a coffee mug in both hands. "Too early," she said. Grace came beside her. "For what?" Louise nodded toward the mountains. Their peaks had disappeared. A dark bank of cloud had swallowed the ridges overnight. Snow. Grace looked at the calendar tacked behind the counter. It was still early autumn. Weeks early. Louise took another drink. Mountains don't check calendars. By noon, the first flakes fell. They were small at first. Dry, almost harmless. Children ran beneath them along Main Street. 2 ranch hands laughed while loading oats outside the feed store. Then the wind changed. By 3, snow was moving sideways. The road north disappeared beyond the last row of buildings. Grace stood in the bakery doorway and watched Louise pull the shutters closed. "You expecting this to last?" Louise slid the wooden bar into place. "I expect weather to do whatever makes people regret not preparing." Grace looked toward the north road. Blackstone lay 9 miles beyond it. She thought of the ration sacks, the sealed flour bins, the smoked meat, the dried vegetables stacked in jars and canvas sacks. Daniel had told her Briggs had stolen more than they first realized. How much remained? Grace pushed the thought away. Blackstone wasn't her responsibility anymore. She kneaded bread, checked the oven, cut yesterday's loaves into thick slices for soup. By evening, the storm had deepened. Travelers began arriving at the hotel from the South Road. One freight wagon had turned back near Cottonwood Creek. Another had been forced into a ditch outside town. Louise served coffee at the mercantile counter long after dark because half the town had come in looking for news. Grace stayed in the kitchen. She could hear everything. "Pass is closing. Cattle'll drift east in this wind. Blackstone's got men enough. Men don't matter if supplies can't move." Grace stopped slicing onions. Louise's voice came from the front room. "What about their stores?" A rancher answered. "Heard Briggs cleaned them out worse than anybody knew." Grace set down the knife. The room felt too quiet. A few minutes later, Louise entered carrying 2 empty mugs. "Don't." Grace looked at her. "Don't what?" "Look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're trying to decide whether something is your problem." Grace wiped the knife. "It isn't." Louise put the mugs in the wash basin. "All right." Grace stared at her. "You don't believe me?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Louise dried her hands. "Blackstone's not a helpless widow, Grace. They have cattle, men, money. Money won't open a mountain pass." Louise met her eyes. There it was. Grace turned back to the onions. The storm screamed around the building. By morning, snow stood nearly 2 feet against the north side of Main Street. The telegraph line had gone down sometime before dawn. A rider from a smaller ranch east of town came in with frost along his hat brim and reported drifts deep enough to turn back loaded wagons. Then the news from Blackstone arrived. Not from Daniel, from Charlie Mills. He rode into town shortly after 10, his horse coated in ice and foam. Grace saw him through the bakery window. He stumbled into the mercantile. Louise reached him first. Grace stayed behind the counter. Charlie removed his gloves with stiff fingers. "Need quinine? Lamp oil?" Anything you can spare? Louise began collecting items. What happened? Two families got caught south of the pass. They're at Blackstone now. Another wagon came in yesterday. Nearly 50 people counting our hands. Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of the breadboard. Food? Charlie heard her. He looked toward the kitchen. We've got beef. That's not what I asked. He lowered his eyes. Not good. Grace came forward. How much flour? Daniel said maybe 8 days if we stretch it. Beans? Less. Dried vegetables? Charlie blinked. Those sacks you made are still sealed. Grace's breath caught. All of them? Near enough. She closed her eyes for 1 second. The emergency stores. The ones Briggs mocked. The ones Daniel let her prepare anyway. Louise looked at her. Grace opened her eyes. How bad is the road? Charlie shook his head. Bad. Can a wagon make it? Not today. A horse? If you know where the road used to be. Louise said. Grace. Grace ignored her. She walked upstairs. Her room was cold. Snow pressed white against the lower part of the window. Grace pulled her heavy wool dress from the peg, changed quickly, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and put her mother's recipe book into a leather satchel. Then she stopped. The blue paint sample sat on the washstand. She looked at it. 6 tables. Clean windows. A door that belonged to her. She slipped the sample into the recipe book. Not because she expected to need it, because she wanted to remember that returning to Blackstone did not mean giving anything up. Louise was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. You sure? No. Good. Grace frowned. Louise handed her a pair of heavy gloves. People who are certain in a storm usually end up frozen. Grace pulled them on. Charlie looked at her. You coming? Yes. The ride took nearly 4 hours. Snow erased every familiar shape. Fence posts appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Cottonwood Creek was a black strip between white banks. Twice Charlie dismounted to find the road beneath the drifts. Grace's legs went numb inside her boots. She kept going. By the time Blackstone appeared through the storm, smoke rolled from every chimney. Men moved between barns carrying blankets, feed, and split wood. Cattle crowded the lower corrals for shelter. Grace dismounted beside the bunkhouse. Nobody cheered. Nobody made a speech. Charlie simply took her horse. Grace walked toward the kitchen carrying her satchel. The door opened before she reached it. Daniel stood there. Snow covered his shoulders. His beard had caught small white crystals. He looked more tired than she had ever seen him. For several seconds, neither spoke. His eyes went to the satchel, then to her face. I didn't send for you. Grace pulled off one glove with her teeth. I know. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Something in his shoulders eased. Not much. Enough. Grace stepped toward the doorway. He moved aside. She entered. The kitchen looked as if a storm had already passed through it. Pots everywhere. Half a sack of flour open on the table. Children sitting near the stove. 2 women cutting potatoes. A ranch hand stirring stew far too quickly. Grace set down her satchel. Stop. The man froze. You're breaking them apart. He lifted the spoon. Grace took it. She looked around the room. How many people exactly? Daniel answered from behind her. 49. Children? 7. Anybody sick? 1 fever. Dr. Mason's stuck in Pine Hollow. Grace nodded. How much flour? 8 days. If everybody eats normal? Yes. They won't. Daniel said nothing. Grace turned toward the pantry. Beans? 2 barrels. Dried meat? Enough. Vegetables? Your stores. Grace looked at him. He corrected himself. The stores you prepared. That mattered too. Grace opened the pantry. Rows of sealed sacks and jars sat exactly where she had left them. Emergency rations, dried onions, carrots, apples, hard biscuits, small bags of salt and sugar. She touched one canvas sack. Dry, safe, still there. Behind her, Daniel said quietly, I didn't touch them except to count. Grace looked back. I wasn't worried about that. He understood what she meant. Not anymore. Not in this moment. Grace rolled up her sleeves. All right. She pointed toward the flour. Half portions of bread starting tonight. Nobody gets seconds unless I say so. One of the cowboys stared. Grace looked at him. You want to be hungry tomorrow or hungry next week? He shook his head. Next week sounds better, good. She pointed toward the children. They eat first, then to the 2 women. Peel those potatoes thinner. Save every usable scrap. Daniel stood near the door. Grace looked at him. Why are you still here? He almost smiled. What do you need? More wood. How much? Grace paused, then said, 2 armloads. Daniel nodded. Learning. He went out. Grace watched the door close behind him, only for a second. Then she returned to the stove. The snow did not stop. By nightfall, the road to Pine Hollow was gone beneath drifts. Blackstone had become an island of firelight, cattle, frightened travelers, and 50 mouths waiting for morning. Grace stood at the center of the kitchen, with her mother's recipe book open beside the flour scale. Across the room, Daniel carried in the wood she had asked for. He placed it exactly where she wanted. No more, no less. Grace had returned to his ranch. But this time there was no misunderstanding between them. Daniel owned Blackstone. Grace owned her choice to be there. And when he stepped aside and let her take command of the kitchen, both of them understood that difference. By the second morning, Blackstone had settled into a hard, careful rhythm. Grace stood at the long work table before sunrise, weighing flour on a brass scale while snow pressed against the windows in white ridges. Nothing was wasted. Biscuits were smaller. Coffee was thinner. Stew carried more potatoes and fewer pieces of beef. The children still received full portions. The men did not complain, not after Grace explained the numbers. 8 days if you eat like Roundup. She looked around the dining room. 12 if you eat like you intend to live through winter. Charlie Mills raised his mug. 12 sounds sensible. A few men laughed. The tension broke. For a little while. Outside, Daniel barely came indoors. He and the ranch hands moved cattle from the exposed north slopes, cleared roofs before snow grew too heavy, carried feed to the lower corrals, and kept paths open between buildings with shovels and wide wooden scrapers. Grace sometimes saw him through the kitchen window. A giant shape in the white, shoulders bent against the wind, a rope over one arm, snow blowing across him until he nearly disappeared. Each time he came in, he stamped his boots at the door, then knocked, even now, even during a storm. Grace would look toward the sound. Come in. Daniel entered only after she answered. He never stayed long. One morning, she handed him coffee before he asked. He wrapped both hands around the mug. Strong. You've complained about mine before. No. You made a face. I was impressed. Grace snorted. Daniel drank. He looked exhausted. There was a fresh tear at one elbow of his coat. Grace noticed. She said nothing. Instead, when he left, she placed a needle and dark thread beside the stove for later. That evening, she repaired the coat while bread baked. Daniel found it hanging by the kitchen door. He ran one thumb over the stitching. Grace pretended not to see. By the third day, the storm had changed. The snowfall weakened. The wind did not. It came hard from the west, lifting old snow from the ground and driving it in sheets across the ranch. Visibility dropped to a few yards. The mountains vanished completely. At noon, one of the ranch hands came through the kitchen carrying news that a barn roof had begun to bow. Daniel organized men immediately. Grace watched him from the doorway. No shouting, no panic, just clear orders. Move the tack first. Get the mares into the south barn. Leave the hay. Roof comes before hay. Men moved because he did. Grace understood something she had not fully seen before. Daniel's quiet was not absence. It was discipline. He did not need to make noise to have authority. That evening, he returned after dark. Grace was feeding the last children at the end of the dining table. Daniel stopped inside the door. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, looked up at him. "Are you the giant?" Daniel glanced at Grace. Grace covered her mouth with one hand. He looked back at the child. "Depends who's asking." The girl considered. "My brother said you can lift a cow." Daniel shook his head. "Your brother lies. Can you lift a horse?" "No." "A calf?" Daniel sighed. "Probably." The girl smiled. Grace turned away so he would not see her laughing. The next morning, everything changed. It happened just after 9. Grace was cutting dried apples into a pot when horses came hard into the yard. Not walking, running, men shouted. The kitchen door opened. A ranch hand stumbled inside, half frozen. His scarf was stiff with ice. Snow clung to his eyelashes. Daniel appeared behind him. "Sit down." Grace already had a chair ready. The man collapsed into it. "There's a wagon." Daniel crouched beside him. "Where?" "North Road, near Miller's Cut." "How many?" "2 families." The man swallowed. "Wheel broke. Horses tangled." "They've got children." Grace stopped cutting. Daniel's face went still. "How long ago?" 3 hours. Maybe 4. Why didn't they come with you?" "One man hurt his leg. Women wouldn't leave the children." Daniel stood. Grace knew before he spoke. "No." He looked at her. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. Daniel said quietly, "Grace, you can't see 10 feet. I know the road. You knew the road before the snow buried it too." He did not argue. That made her angrier. Daniel walked toward the coat hooks. Grace followed. "Send 5 men." "I am." "Send 6." "I am." "And you stay here." Daniel turned. Their eyes met. Around them, the kitchen had gone quiet. Grace lowered her voice. "You own this ranch. There are 50 people depending on you, and 2 families out there depending on somebody. You don't have to be the somebody." "No." He paused. "But I am." Grace stared at him. For 1 second, she hated that she understood. That was the worst part. Daniel put on his coat. Grace looked at his hands, then turned sharply toward the pantry. She pulled down one of the emergency ration sacks, opened it. Dried beef, hard biscuits, a small packet of sugar. She added a flask of hot coffee from the stove and wrapped the whole thing in cloth. Daniel waited. Grace pushed the bundle against his chest. Their hands met around it. Neither let go. Come back hungry. Daniel looked down at her. The room seemed very small suddenly. You planning to feed me? Grace swallowed. If you come back. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly over hers. Then he released. I'll do my best. That's not what I said. His mouth moved. Almost a smile. Yes, ma'am. Grace glared. Don't start. He put on his hat. Then he left. The door closed. Grace stood staring at it. For 5 seconds. Then she went back to work. That was the only way she knew how to wait. Measure flour. Stir soup. Count biscuits. Feed children. Check the door. Cut meat. Add wood. Check the door. By noon, no horses. At 1, none. At 2, the wind worsened. Grace began another batch of broth. Her hands moved too fast. Louisa Kent, one of the stranded mothers, touched her arm. Grace, I'm fine. You've cut the same carrot 3 times. Grace looked down. The carrot was nearly pulp. She set the knife aside. Then I suppose it needed cutting. At 3, one of the cowboys went outside to listen. Nothing. At 4, the light began to fade. Grace stood at the kitchen window. She had told herself not to. She did anyway. The yard was white. The barns were gray shapes behind blowing snow. No riders. Grace pressed her fingertips against the window frame. Behind her, the stove crackled. A child laughed. Someone coughed. Everything kept moving. She hated that too. At nearly 5, a horse screamed outside. Grace turned. Another answered. Then men began shouting. She was already moving. The kitchen door flew open. Cold air rushed in. Grace! Charlie Mills! They're back! She ran. Snow hit her face hard enough to sting. Lanterns moved through the yard. Horses staggered in through the gate. Behind them came a wagon pulled by 2 exhausted teams. A woman held a child beneath a blanket. Another man rode beside the wheel. They had found the families. Grace searched past them. Daniel? Nobody answered immediately. Her stomach dropped. Then she saw him, walking beside his horse. Not riding. One hand held the saddle horn. His steps were uneven. Snow covered his coat from shoulders to boots. Grace moved toward him. Daniel looked up. He saw her. He took 1 step, then another. His knees gave way. Grace reached him before he hit the ground. All 6 feet 7 inches of him came down against her shoulder. She staggered. Held. Daniel. His eyes opened briefly. Made it. Grace wrapped both arms around him. You idiot. Probably. His weight shifted. 2 ranch hands rushed forward. Grace did not let go until they had him. They carried him inside. Near the stove, Daniel opened his eyes once more. Grace knelt beside him. His face was pale from cold. His fingers trembled, but he was alive. She touched his cheek, only for a second, then pulled her hand back. Daniel saw. Food? Grace stared at him. What? He swallowed. You said come back hungry. Grace's eyes burned. She looked down at the floor, then back at him. You nearly froze to death and you're asking about supper. Seemed important. A laugh broke out of her before she could stop it. Half laugh, half something else. Grace wiped quickly beneath one eye. Daniel watched her. She stood. Yes. Her voice shook once, then steadied. I'll feed you. Outside, the storm still covered Blackstone in white. Inside, the stranded families sat near the fire. Children ate warm broth. Cowboys carried blankets. And the largest man on the ranch lay wrapped beside the stove, alive because he had gone into the storm for people who needed him. Grace stood over a pot of soup and stirred it slowly. For weeks, she had been afraid that trusting Daniel would mean surrendering something. But as she looked toward him now, she understood the choice before her was not whether she needed him. It was whether she was willing to admit how much she wanted him to come back. Daniel slept for nearly 14 hours. Grace knew because she counted them without meaning to. He lay on a narrow cot pulled close to the kitchen stove, wrapped in wool blankets while the storm weakened outside. Every few hours, she touched the back of her fingers to his forehead, checked that his breathing remained steady, then returned to the work table before anyone could notice how often she looked his way. By morning, sunlight finally appeared through the western windows. Weak, colorless, but sunlight. Grace was sitting in a chair beside the stove when sleep caught her. Her head rested against the wall. Her hands lay loose in her lap. One had slipped close to the edge of Daniel's blanket sometime during the night. When Daniel opened his eyes, that was the first thing he saw. Grace. Still there. He watched her for several seconds. Then he shifted. The cot creaked. Grace woke immediately. Her eyes found his. How long? Daniel's voice was rough. Since yesterday afternoon. No. How long were you sitting there? Grace straightened. That isn't important. It was to me. She reached for the coffee pot. You nearly froze yourself to death. You're not in a position to ask difficult questions. Daniel slowly pushed himself upright. Grace pointed at him. Don't. He stopped. She poured coffee into a mug and handed it over. Daniel wrapped both hands around it. Grace watched his fingers. The trembling had nearly stopped. He took a drink, still strong. You're still complaining. I'm observing. Observe quietly. His eyes warmed slightly. Grace looked away. For a while, neither spoke. The kitchen was almost peaceful. One of the children slept on a bench beneath a quilt. A kettle murmured on the stove. Outside, shovels scraped against packed snow as the ranch hands cleared paths between the buildings. Daniel looked down into his coffee. You came back. Grace's shoulders tightened. Yes. Because of the storm? Because people needed food. He nodded. And because you forgave me? Grace looked at him. Daniel did not look hopeful. He simply waited. That mattered. No. He absorbed the answer without flinching. Grace continued. Coming back here and trusting you again are not the same thing. I know. She watched him. You do? I think I'm finally learning. He lowered his eyes to the mug. I don't expect you to forgive me because I nearly froze in a snowbank. Good. Would be a poor strategy. Grace almost smiled, especially since I know what your strategies are worth. Daniel gave a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. Then his expression settled. I meant what I said in Pine Hollow. Grace's fingers stopped against her apron. I know. He looked at her. She did not say more. Neither did he. For the first time since the line cabin, silence between them did not hide something. It simply gave them room. 3 days later, the road to Pine Hollow reopened. The stranded families left Blackstone in 2 wagons after breakfast. Grace packed biscuits and dried meat for the journey and tucked extra apple preserves into a basket for the children. Daniel stood near the ranch gate wearing the coat she had mended. He was pale but upright, Grace noticed he did not attempt to lift anything heavier than a saddle blanket. Someone had clearly threatened him. Probably half the ranch. Grace climbed onto Charlie Mills's wagon with her trunk. Daniel walked over. You're leaving. My room is in Pine Hollow. I know, my work is there. I know. She looked down at him. He rested one hand against the wagon side but did not ask her to stay. That too mattered. Grace said, "Take care of yourself." Daniel nodded. You too. The wagon rolled away. This time Grace looked back. Daniel was still standing by the gate. He lifted his hat. She raised one gloved hand. Nothing more. It was enough. Winter loosened slowly. For the next few weeks, Grace baked bread for Louise, made pies on Saturdays, and began asking questions about a vacant storefront near the south end of Main Street. Daniel came to Pine Hollow every Thursday. At first, Grace thought it was coincidence. Then Thursday came again. And there he was, his gray gelding tied outside the mercantile. Daniel would climb the back steps, cross the little yard, and stop at the bakery door. Knock. Always knock. Even when Grace was standing 3 feet away looking directly at him. The first Thursday, she made him wait 10 seconds. The second, 5. By the fourth, she called, "Come in," before his knuckles touched the wood. Daniel entered carrying nothing. No gifts, no flowers, no expensive parcels. Sometimes he bought bread, sometimes coffee. Once he sat at the small table near the stove while Grace rolled pie crust and told her about a calf that had somehow gotten itself trapped inside the tack room. Grace laughed until flour fell from her hands. Daniel watched, noticing, always noticing. He never asked when she was returning to Blackstone. Eventually, Grace realized he had stopped assuming she would. That realization softened something she had been protecting very carefully. One cold Thursday afternoon, Daniel arrived while Grace was painting a narrow shelf. The color was blue, not the final door, just a test. He knocked. Grace opened it. Daniel ducked beneath the frame. She stared at him. What? He removed his hat. Nothing. You've been coming here 6 weeks. About that. You knock every time. Yes. Even when the door is open. Sometimes. Why? Daniel looked toward the door, then back at her. Because it's your door. Grace held the paintbrush motionless. She pointed through the window toward the mountains. Beyond Pine Hollow, Blackstone lay somewhere beneath the snowy ridges. You own half of what's on the other side of it. Daniel followed her gesture, then returned his eyes to hers. Didn't say I owned you. The room went still. Grace looked at him for a long time. This man could have entered nearly any building in the valley and been welcomed because of his name. People moved when Daniel Brooks approached. Men listened. Bankers returned his letters. Ranchers changed prices when he sat at the table. Yet here he stood inside a narrow bakery, hat in hand, waiting for a plus-size cook with flour on her sleeve to decide what happened next. Grace set the paintbrush down. Daniel watched her come closer. His expression changed. Not much. Enough. Grace? She stopped in front of him. You talk too much. His eyebrows lifted. I've never been accused of that. There's a first time for everything. She reached up. Daniel was so tall that even standing close, she could barely reach his collar. So Grace caught the front of his coat with both hands. Daniel went perfectly still. She pulled. He understood. The giant cowboy bent toward her. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. Grace didn't. She kissed him. It was not dramatic. No thunder, no music, only the faint hiss of the stove and the smell of fresh bread in Louise Harper's back kitchen. Daniel's hand lifted, stopped beside Grace's waist. He waited. Grace felt the hesitation. She took his wrist and placed his hand lightly against her side. Only then did he hold her. When Grace stepped back, Daniel looked as if somebody had removed every sensible thought from his head. She almost laughed. "Don't make me regret that." Daniel blinked once. "Wouldn't dare." Grace studied his face. 6 weeks earlier, she would have wondered what he wanted in return. A promise. A decision. Her return to Blackstone. Something. Daniel asked for nothing. He simply stood there holding his hat, still looking slightly stunned. Grace smiled. For once, she believed him. Daniel glanced toward the blue-painted shelf. "That the color?" Grace followed his eyes. "For the door?" He nodded. "Maybe. It suits you. You said that before." "I was right before." Grace lifted an eyebrow. "Careful, cowboy." Daniel put his hat back on. "Yes, ma'am." Grace pointed toward the door. "Out." He laughed. Actually laughed. Then he stepped outside. The door remained open behind him. Daniel stopped on the little porch and turned. Grace stood inside. He did not ask whether he could return next Thursday. He didn't need to. Grace rested one hand against the doorframe. "Coffee at 4. Daniel's smile appeared slowly. "I'll be here." Then he walked toward his horse. Grace watched until he reached the street. Only then did she close the door. Not because she wanted him outside, because for the first time in her life, she understood that a closed door did not have to mean loneliness. Not when the man on the other side respected it enough to knock. Spring came slowly to Pine Hollow. Snow withdrew from the shaded sides of buildings first, then from the wagon ruts, then from the open slopes beyond town. Cottonwood buds showed green along the creek. Mud replaced ice on Main Street, and every horse seemed to carry half the road on its legs. Grace spent those weeks working harder than she had at Blackstone. But this time every hour belonged to something with her name on it. The vacant storefront near the south end of town had once been a saddler's shop. The floorboards were scarred. One window had a crack through the lower corner. The stovepipe leaned enough to worry Louise Harper. Grace loved it immediately. 6 tables, she said the first time she stood inside. Louise looked around. 5 comfortably. 6 if people like each other. They usually don't. Then they'll eat faster. Louise laughed. The money took longer. Grace used what she had saved before Blackstone, the wages from the ranch, the bread money from winter, and nearly everything she had earned after the storm. It still wasn't enough. Louise introduced her to a banker named Mr. Ellis, who sat behind a walnut desk and asked more questions than Grace liked. How much would meals cost? How many travelers used the South Road? What would she do during winter? Grace opened her notebook and answered everyone. When Mr. Ellis finally approved the small loan, he slid the papers across the desk. Grace read every line. Twice. Then she signed. Daniel heard about it 2 days later. He came into town on Thursday as usual, tied his gray gelding outside the mercantile, and found Grace scraping old paint from the storefront window frame. He stood on the sidewalk. "You bought it." Grace kept scraping. "I borrowed part of it." Daniel looked at the building, then at her. "I could have." Grace stopped. Daniel stopped too. They looked at each other. He removed his hat. "Never mind." Grace waited. A slow smile pulled at one corner of her mouth. "You're learning, painfully." He stepped inside after she nodded. For the next month, Daniel helped only when Grace asked. That was the rule. He hauled one cast-iron stove from a freight wagon because Grace decided nobody else on Main Street had the back for it. He repaired a loose porch board after she handed him the hammer. He carried flour sacks into storage. When he offered to pay for new front windows, Grace said no. Daniel nodded. When he offered again 3 weeks later, she stared at him. He lifted both hands. Had to make sure. Make sure of what? That no still meant no. Grace pointed toward the door. Out. Daniel went outside laughing. The door itself took 3 coats of paint. Deep blue. Exactly as Grace had imagined. On opening morning, sunlight caught the fresh color before the town was fully awake. A wooden sign hung above it. Parker's Table. Louise stood across the street with her hands on her hips. Looks respectable. Grace adjusted the white apron over her blue dress. That's disappointing. By 7, every table was full. Freighters ate eggs and biscuits near the window. A ranch family shared ham and potatoes near the stove. 2 cowboys from east of town argued quietly over pie. Grace moved between kitchen and dining room with coffee pots in both hands. She was tired. Her feet hurt. She had never been happier. At 7:10, the blue door opened. Daniel ducked beneath it. He wore a clean dark coat and a good shirt, but his boots were dusty from the road. Grace pointed at them. Daniel looked down, then back at her. I wiped them. Not well. He stepped outside. The room laughed. Daniel wiped them again. Then he knocked. Grace stared at him through the open doorway. You are impossible. Still a door. Come in. He took the chair nearest the stove. The same chair became his every Thursday after that. Not reserved. Not marked. He simply arrived early enough to get it. He paid for every meal. Grace charged him exactly what she charged everyone else. Once he left an extra nickel beneath his coffee mug. She handed it back. Daniel looked at the coin. Tip. No. Why? You own a ranch. You don't get special rules. He slipped the nickel into his pocket. Yes, ma'am. Their wedding came the following autumn. Small. No ballroom. No cattlemen lined up to shake Daniel's hand. Louise stood beside Grace. Charlie Mills and Tommy Reed came from Blackstone in their best coats. Afterward, Grace reopened Parker's Table on Monday morning. Daniel went back to Blackstone before dawn. Neither found that strange. Years passed. The blue door faded slightly under Montana winters and was painted again twice. Grace added one more table after all, 7 instead of 6. Daniel claimed that proved she had poor judgment. Grace told him he was welcome to eat elsewhere. He never did. One evening, several years after the wedding, a traveler from Helena stopped at Parker's Table. He was a thin man with a polished coat and a habit of looking out the window every few minutes to make sure his horse remained tied where he had left it. Daniel's saddle was hanging outside. Good leather. Silver fittings. Expensive enough to draw attention. The traveler nodded toward it. That belongs to Brooks? Grace poured coffee. Yes. The Blackstone Brooks? Daniel sat in his usual chair near the stove, reading a cattle bill. He looked up. Depends who's asking. The traveler smiled, didn't expect the richest rancher in the valley to wait in line for supper. Before Grace could answer, Daniel folded the paper. Because the owner doesn't run this place. Grace set his plate down. The traveler laughed. So how does a man with thousands of acres end up marrying his cook? Daniel looked at Grace. She wasn't my cook when she married me. Grace raised one eyebrow. Daniel saw it. And I didn't win her either. The traveler quieted. So did the nearest table. Daniel leaned back in his chair. His eyes stayed on Grace. She chose me back. For a moment, Grace said nothing. Then the blue door opened. A gust of cold mountain air rolled through the room, carrying the smell of pine smoke and snow from the street. Daniel started to rise. Grace pointed at his plate. "Sit down, cowboy. Your food's getting cold." Daniel sat. Immediately. The whole dining room laughed. Grace turned back toward the stove with the smallest smile. Outside, the mountains above Blackstone stood dark beneath the evening sky. Inside Parker's table, coffee steamed in thick white mugs, boots rested beneath scarred wooden tables, and the blue door closed softly against the cold. Daniel owned miles of pasture, cattle, barns, and land stretching farther than most people could see. Grace owned the room around her, the stove, the receipts in the drawer, the keys in her apron pocket, the name above the door, and neither had been required to become smaller for the other to stay. A few minutes later, Daniel finished his supper and carried his plate toward the kitchen. Grace looked up. "Where do you think you're going?" "Washbench." She narrowed her eyes. "You working here now?" Daniel stopped. "No." "Then sit down." He obeyed. The traveler laughed again. Daniel only smiled. Years earlier, Grace Parker had thought the quiet giant beside the Blackstone wagon was just another cowboy. Daniel Brooks had thought hiding his ranch might be the only way anyone would ever see the man beneath the name. They had both been wrong. Love had not asked Grace to give up her independence, and it had not asked Daniel to surrender his strength. It had asked something harder of both of them. Tell the truth, wait at the door, and let the other person choose. Daniel looked toward the kitchen. Grace caught his eye. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The blue door remained closed against the cold, and if Daniel ever found it shut when he arrived, he still knocked. Imagine standing where Grace once stood, with almost nothing except a battered trunk, an old recipe book, and the quiet hope that somewhere in this wide country there might be a place where you would not have to apologize for who you were. Then imagine finally finding love, and discovering that trusting it might be harder than surviving without it. Grace could have walked away forever. Daniel could have tried to win her back with money, land, and promises. Instead, she learned to open the door again, and he learned that loving someone sometimes means standing outside patiently until they choose to let you in. Maybe that was what made their story worth remembering. Grace didn't need Daniel to rescue her. Daniel didn't need Grace to make his ranch complete. They chose each other after disappointment, anger, distance, and truth had stripped away every easy reason to stay. Sometimes a second chance isn't about forgetting what hurt. It's about seeing whether two people can build something better where the hurt once stood. If you had been Grace, would you have opened that blue door again? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about love, healing, mystery, and people finding their way home still mean something to you, subscribe and stay a while. There are many more stories waiting just beyond the next door.